You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Welcome to the second episode of the BMI Podcast for 2026. Hopefully you all got to listen to the first one with Dr. Johnny Stevens. That was an excellent interview. And if you haven't got to hear it, I'd ask you to go back and listen to it. Dr. Stevens gives us some great insight into what it's like to have been obese and to go through the process, and he's done an amazing job. So for those of you that are new to the BMI Podcast, welcome. And for those of you that have been with us all along, nice to have you back. So today we're going to lay the groundwork for next week's podcast. As you may have seen, the new dietary guidelines for America have been released. Dr. Britt Morris is going to come up and go over those with us next week. But I want to lay the groundwork for a couple things prior to that I think are important that you understand when you look at the new guidelines, because the new guidelines are very different than the old guidelines. One thing that I think is super important for everybody to understand is that we at the BMI Podcast want to remain completely apolitical. And of course, everybody associated with the podcast and everywhere else has their opinions, but we want this to be an apolitical site. We don't want you to know what we think. We just want to be able to present data to you. That being said, just because we like or dislike certain data doesn't mean that we like or dislike the politicians behind it. So if you can just extract the information from the people that produce it, whether it's the old guidelines or the new guidelines, and just look at it on a scientific level. That's what we're asking you to do at the BMI Podcast, and that's what we try to do. I think it's important to understand why the guidelines have been switched and why it's important. And again, although we want to remain apolitical, I think it's very important that you understand that we at the BMI Podcast think that these changes are excellent. We think that they are very in line scientifically with what needs to be done. And I think if you look at the old guidelines and you look at the health of society, you'll realize that the old guidelines were not good. Now, I think it's also worth stating that the old guidelines weren't necessarily from the left or the right? They were an amalgamation of bad decisions that dated back at least to the 1950s. And both parties were involved in making bad decisions that led us up to this point. And interestingly, the current guidelines, although under a Republican administration, are actually being led by a Democrat. And I get it. He's not exactly a standard Democrat, but nevertheless, it's just a bipartisan-ish guidelines, and we want the politics to be out of it. In today's episode, I want to lay the groundwork for why the changes need to be made. And then I want to also take just a little bit of time to define the, quote, whole foods diet, end quote. That's one of the things that you'll see in the new guidelines where they talk a lot about whole foods. And although they may reference a whole foods diet, there is no clear whole foods diet. And it definitely has nothing to do with the store, Whole Foods. But it's just basically whole foods, foods that are whole and have been minimally processed or not processed at all. So let's first start and just do a quick review of some of the data that ultimately led to the decision to revamp the guidelines and to make health an overall priority for America. The current administration in February released a statement called Make America Healthy Again. And again, I know that is somewhat off-putting to some people, but again, just stick with us as we get through this. The point of Make America Healthy Again is just simply the fact we're not a healthy nation. Chronic disease is a major contributor to the death and disability of all of our citizens, but particularly children. So the Make America Healthy Again Commission was actually charged with studying the scope of childhood chronic disease, not so much adult, but childhood chronic disease and any potential contributing factors, including the diet. There was also other factors that were studied in the MAHA report, but today we're going to talk about the needs of the diet, and we'll discuss briefly some of the other issues. But basically the point is to examine the root cause of child health and the deterioration that we've seen over the past few generations. And hopefully, based on recognizing the problem and putting it out there, then making adjustments, we can start to reverse that course and get our children healthier, which in turn will allow our nation to be healthier. So the ultimate goal is to reverse the childhood chronic disease crisis by identifying its cause and moving forward. What are the main causes? Well, a big part of it is just a very poor diet that we have. over the last few decades, we've had a significant shift in the diet of all Americans, particularly children. And it's estimated now that nearly 70% of all calories consumed by kids are from ultra-processed foods. And of course, that leads to obesity. We have a higher incidence of diabetes and all these chronic medical conditions that we're seeing. There's also a significant lack of physical activity and chronic stress. The lack of physical activity is multifactorial, but has a lot to do with screen time, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and just a lack of physical activity. There's less PE classes, there's less recesses. And so all of this leads to not only less activity, but also a fair amount of social isolation. Because if these kids are just sitting inside instead of outside playing on the playground, if they're sitting inside on their phone, oftentimes that's solitary. They may sit with groups, but they're not really interacting that much. They're interacting more with their phone. And we'll discuss a little bit about the impact of that. One other quick thing that before we get too far into it, if you're new to the podcast and you haven't listened to some of the talks about the politics of our food, I'd like to direct you back to 3 different episodes. Episode 14, it's called You're Being Lied to and Your Nutrition is Being Manipulated. That goes over a lot of the history of where these guidelines came from and even some of the background to it. And again, it's apolitical, but I think it gives good insight as to what's going on. Also, episode 26 goes over an article called What If It's Been a Big Fat Lie? It's an excellent article that was written a few decades ago, all talking about the inaccurate assumption that fat was the problem. And lastly, episode 28 is When Politics Shape Our Plates. So episode 14, episode 26, and episode 28 lay a little bit of background as well. So if you haven't listened to those, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. Back to the current information. So is childhood health, is it a international problem or is it just national? Well, I would say that it's definitely an international problem. We're seeing higher rates of obesity, heart disease, and diabetes in kids across the world. But it's interesting, despite outspending other countries by more than double per capita on healthcare, the United States rates last in life expectancy among high-income countries. So clearly, what we're doing isn't working. In 2023 alone, health expenditures grew by about 4.4%, which outpaced the real GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States, which was just 2.5%. So our healthcare expenditures are much higher than the GDP, and we're actually on an unsustainable course with how we are going about healthcare expenditures. But for today's episode, I think it's just important to understand that we're outspending with worse outcomes. We've talked before about the American healthcare system, and I think a better way to think of it is the American sick care system, right? We respond to illness, not to prevention. When you look at the reimbursement for medical expenses, it's not based on how you prevent disease. It's based on what you do to treat it once it's present. So if we could just get in front of that, we would be in good shape. It's also interesting, our healthcare system is really designed for acute care illness, right? With these big hospitals and inpatient management. Everything's really based on acute care. You know, if you're in a car accident or you're shot or you're in a motorcycle accident, anything, you need acute care, right? You need that incredible technology that you have in the emergency departments and the ORs and inpatient care and round-the-clock nursing. But what kills most Americans is chronic illness, coronary artery disease, diabetes, obesity. And so our healthcare system, although it's very well funded for acute care, the problem is that in this country, most of what kills us is chronic conditions. And so historically, there's been no incentive for hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, even physicians to prevent disease. It's always really been more about managing it once it's present because that's how money is made in the healthcare world. And interestingly, a huge part of the GDP of this country is healthcare. When you look at the largest employers in cities across the country, you'll see that the healthcare industry is a major employer in many, if not most cities in the U.S. And so if all of a sudden we started doing things that were healthy, that would affect our economy. Now, I think it could affect it positively as well. If people were healthier, we could get into different lines of work. And I do worry a little bit about this idea of, not working with AI, all these jobs being replaced because of AI, freeing up people to do the things that they want to do. And I don't exactly know what that looks like. I don't think any of us do. But if people are not employed, they don't have to go to work, but somehow they have income because all of the jobs have been taken over by artificial intelligence, that sounds real good. Gives you time to do the things you want, to enjoy life and all. But what we know is if 70% of the calories we're eating are from ultra-processed foods, and we're not exercising, we're not doing the things to take care of ourselves, and then all of a sudden we don't even have to get out of bed to go to work, and we don't even have to spend 8 hours in some sort of capacity of movement and maybe this purpose, I can only imagine we'd have the potential for significant healthcare decline with that. The American healthcare system really could do much better by preventing and working to reverse disease, but not just managing patients once they get sick. So how bad is it? So over 40% of the roughly 73 million children in this country have at least one chronic health condition. And chronic health condition defined by the CDC includes asthma, allergies, obesity, autoimmune disease, or behavioral disorders. Also, an interesting fact is over 75% of Americans' youth, that is, the kids in the U.S. under 17 years of age, are ineligible for military service, primarily due to obesity. They wouldn't be able to pass a physical fitness test, or they have mental health challenges. So just briefly, let's just hit the incidence of illness in the U.S. compared to other countries. The prevalence of obesity amongst the G7 countries being Italy, the UK, Canada, Germany, France, Japan, and the U.S. The U.S. has nearly doubled the rate of obesity amongst our G7 peers. It's also known that we're having an increasing incidence of diabetes in this country, with about 3.5 kids per 1,000 being diagnosed with diabetes, with an associated 65% increase in type 1 and more than a 600% increase in type 2. The incidence of autism is on the rise, and it's highly variable. It's interesting, in Laredo, Texas, it's the lowest in the country at about 9.7 per 1,000 kiddos. And in California, as a statewide average, it's 53 per 100,000. Now, it's interesting, there is a significant increase in the incidence of autism dating from about 2000 up when you look at the graph. However, the diagnosis of autism has also become more of a forefront. So it could be just more of a bias toward what it is. Before we just didn't really have very clear boundaries as to what it is. What we know is when you look at this crisis in Minnesota, amongst the Somali population, some of the data showed like an 82% incidence of autism. Well, we know that that's not going to be accurate either, right? Although there's an increasing incidence, it may not all be because it's becoming more prevalent in society. It may be our diagnostic criteria has expanded, and so it catches more people. Tough to know, but nevertheless, there's some neurodevelopmental disorders that definitely seem to be on the increase over the past couple decades in this country. Childhood cancer has significantly risen from the 1970s to its current status. It's risen approximately 40% since 1975. Mental health crisis is on the rise amongst teenagers, with depression rates doubling in the teenage population from 2009 to 2019, and more than 1 in 4 teenage girls reporting a major depressive episode in the past year. 3 million high school students seriously considered suicide in 2023. And suicide deaths among 10 to 24-year-olds increased by 62% and is now the second leading cause of death in children ages 15 to 19 years old. Allergies and autoimmune disorders seem to be on the rise, with 1 in 4 American children suffering from allergies, which include seasonal allergies, eczema, and food allergies. Between 1997 and 2018, it's estimated that food allergy prevalence increased by about 88%, which I feel is accurate because, when I was a kid, it didn't seem like anybody had food allergies. There was no peanut allergies. There was none of these tree nut allergies or any of this stuff. And then fast forward to my children's generation, half the time we couldn't take stuff to the classroom because so many kids had allergies. In my world, we deal a lot with inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, both of which are autoimmune disorders. There's been a 25% increase over the last decade in that amongst children. So what's driving the increase in childhood chronic disease? Well, that's not entirely clear, but that's the point of this commission, was to try to sort that out. And it's felt that a big player in the chronic illness is just simply the food that we're eating and the chemicals that they're exposed to and the medications that they're taking and the change in the lifestyle and behavior with a more sedentary lifestyle, really secondary to phones. Again, 70% of the calories consumed by children in the U.S. are from ultra-processed foods, which are high in sugars and chemical additives, saturated fats, and oftentimes lack just basic nutrients. So now on to the dietary component. So where did ultra-processed foods come from, and what does that even mean? Well, post-World War II, there was concern that the U.S. would be responsible for an increasing proportion of agricultural output for the entire world. And so output increased through mechanization and synthetic fertilizers, industrial scale farming, and then shelf-stable processing. all of which was rooted with good intentions. But the industrial manufactured food products had to undergo significant processing so that they could be shelf stable and they could be shipped. That was the beginning of a lot of this ultra processed food. And then add to that the Ansel Keys study. Let's just briefly talk about that. In the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, there was a marine biologist by the name of Ansel Keys who had a hypothesis that fat was the cause of coronary artery disease. And it was really fueled by President Eisenhower's heart attack. And so he undertook this study, and it actually was a 22-country study, but not consistent with the scientific method. Instead of taking all the data and analyzing it and concluding that maybe he was wrong, what he did was he cherry-picked the data, and he took the 7 countries that supported his hypothesis and then disregarded the data from the others. So what was a 22-country study is known as the 7-country study. And basically, those 7 countries did, in fact, have higher incidences of heart disease amongst people that had increased dietary fat. But again, he selected the data to meet his hypothesis, which is not how science works, right? You have a hypothesis, and then you conduct a study, and then you just analyze the data. And if you're wrong, that's okay, right? In science, even if you're wrong, it's still correct. It's still the right thing to publish, because although your hypothesis might have been incorrect, the data points to the truth. Well, Ansel Keys didn't do that, and ultimately he ended up getting on the board of nutrition for the American Heart Association with strong funding, I believe, from Procter & Gamble. And then this whole process of removing fat, because they surmised that fat was the problem. And again, I don't know that this was gross negligence. I don't know that it was intentional. It may have been very well intended. However, manipulation of the data is never good. And ultimately, our society has paid a huge price for this poor study. And so what's happened is they've spent the last few decades removing fat from food. And of course, when you do that, it doesn't taste good. So then they put sugar in. And so if you look at our incidences of diabetes and obesity and all of these things, they significantly have gone up since the time of that study. And with it, all of the chronic disease markers have risen in children and adults. So processed foods or ultra processed foods. So if you go to a grocery store, it's over 70% of the 300,000 branded food products available in your typical grocery store are ultra processed. How does that compare to other countries? 50% of the calories consumed by Americans are from ultra processed foods, right? 70% of the calories of our children come from ultra processed foods. But when you look at other countries like Portugal, Italy, and France, their ultra processed food consumption is only about 10 to 31%. And then when you look at our obesity rate, about 40 to 50% of Americans are obese compared to less than 25% of the Portuguese, Italian, and French populations. The other thing about ultra-processed foods is it depletes nutrients. So how does it do that? Well, let's talk about the grains. So if you process grains, oftentimes you remove the bran and the germ, which is where the fiber is and the protein, and it strips away essential vitamins and minerals. And then you put in a lot of sugars. It's estimated that 17 teaspoons of sugar are taken in daily by a typical American and 60 pounds of sugar annually. A lot of this is in the form of high fructose corn syrup and other added sugars. And we've talked before about the way fructose is processed through the liver into pyruvate is in the exact same mechanism as we do alcohol. So when patients have fatty liver or chronic liver disease from fructose, they seem surprised. But if, the same person drank a lot of alcohol, they wouldn't be surprised at all. Another interesting fact is if you look at patients that are on a whole food diet or a processed food diet, the people that are on processed food diets tend to consume about 500 calories more per day than those on whole foods. And a lot of that's probably because of fiber. They actually did a study where they put people inpatient. It was a very small study. I think it was like 20 people. They put them in a hospital and they gave them unlimited ultra-processed foods for 2 weeks. And then there was a washout period. And then they did the same thing, same people, unlimited whole foods for 2 weeks. And then they went back and analyzed their diet. And on average, they took in an additional 500 calories per day with ultra-processed foods. So, these ultra-processed foods, not only are they high in sugar and salt, but they're also genetically modified. And there's things about them that just make you hungry. So we've talked a little bit before. If you take in an ultra-processed food that just has a sort of simple carbohydrate, right? It's not bound to fiber at all. And you eat it, you get a sort of sense of being full quickly. But although that sugar hits your bloodstream really quick, which then causes your insulin levels to rise. right? The insulin levels rise to drive the sugar into the cells and all the nutrients into the cells. And then it comes down quickly, right? The rate that the insulin drops quickly stimulates the hypothalamus and says, oh, I'm hungry. So then you're hungry again. That's why when you eat just junk food, you're hungry, and then 30 minutes later, you're hungry again, as opposed to when you eat something like chicken or steak or vegetables, right? You have a sense of being full for longer. And that sense of satiety, that sense of being full, leads to decreased caloric intake, but also just the actual products that you took in the first place tend to be lower in caloric density. So additionally, these ultra-processed foods, they have a lot of chemicals added to them, and it's felt that they likely disrupt hormones and various hunger signals like we talked about there, which then promote overeating and weight gain. What are the chemicals that they add? Well, it's tough to know, and it's tough to know what role they have, either individually or collectively. Remember, they add emulsifiers, binders, sweeteners, colorings, preservatives to make them shelf stable. I always found it interesting. McDonald's there for a while, maybe they still have, but there for a while they had apples. You could get an apple instead of French fries, which that's great. And on the surface, we've talked before, you don't have to make the best choice, you just make the better choice. So if you opt to have apples, maybe it was just in the kids' meals, but if you opt for that instead of the French fries, good choice. But the apples would come, they were pre-cut, they would be in these little packages, and they look great. They look completely normal. When you cut an apple, it looks great, but 20 minutes later, it's kind of brown. And I always wondered, how do they do that, right? And it has something to do with the packaging, but also has something to do with whatever preservatives they put in. So these preservatives and these emulsifiers and colorings and all that, those clearly add chemicals to our body that somehow have the potential to disrupt our normal sense of satiety and all of the regulation that goes into hunger and fullness. And then, of course, there's also just food colorings. Red dye 40 has been kind of vilified here. Kennedy has worked hard to get it out of the diet, but it's been known to cause behavioral issues in children, such as hyperactivity, symptoms consistent with ADHD. I can remember as a kid, going to church, and they didn't have ADHD when I was a kid. They didn't have the diagnosis. I was just I talked a lot, I guess is what they said. And so I remember going to Sunday school, and my parents wouldn't allow me to have the Kool-Aid. They'd bring Kool-Aid and cookies to Sunday school. And if it was red Kool-Aid, I couldn't have it. I don't know. That's not scientific. I'm not claiming that it is. But we've known that some of these dyes cause problems. And so I know he's worked hard to get red dye 40 out. And I think some of these dyes are not allowed in foreign countries, right? They're felt to be carcinogenic. And I believe red dye 40 is one of them. Also, artificial sweeteners, of which there are a lot, oftentimes used in diet sodas, they actually can cause some gut microbiome shifts that have been linked to obesity. And we know that there's an increase in fermectins as opposed to bacteroides, which are two specific gut microbiome. And patients that suffer with obesity have a higher ratio of fermectins to bacteroides. There's a lot about the microbiome that we're learning that we don't really know at this point. But as it comes out, we'll learn more and more. Again, ultra-processed foods and their role. The British Medical Journal did a meta-analysis of 45 published studies that included nearly 10 million participants. And what they found was that higher consumption of ultra-processed foods was linked to 32 adverse health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, mental health disorders, and more importantly, all-cause mortality. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association followed over 44,000 adults and found that for every 10% increase in intake of ultra-processed food was associated with a 14% increase of all-cause mortality. Compare that to research that looks at diets that are centered on whole foods, and they show that there's a lower incidence of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and certain cancers, as well as mental illness. Whole foods in this incidence, including leafy greens, salmon, legumes, nuts, beef, whole milk. Clearly, I think we have data out there showing that ultra-processed foods, although may not be the sole cause of all of these problems, it's clearly something that we can address, and it's a good starting point. So what's the driving force behind ultra-processed foods? Well, they're super convenient and they're cheap. They're packageable. You can get them. You can store them. They have a longer shelf life, right? If you just go with whole foods, it's definitely more expensive and it is more difficult because you have to go shopping more often because they just don't have the shelf stability. But abundance and affordability also is an issue for some people. And so it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not like you can't have any processed foods or ultra processed foods. It's just kind of trying to make the best decision where you can. I think we talked a little bit about a book called Fiat Food by Michael Lesak, and he just talks about the role of the big food industry and how much control they have. And it's interesting, when you look at spending, in 2023, only 16% of every dollar actually went to farmers. 84% went to food manufacturers, marketers, and distributors. And we know there's really only about 4 companies that control about 80% of the meat market in the U.S. So there's a lot of consolidation. And with that comes a lot of money, and with that comes a lot of influence, which then distorts the nutrition and marketing. To that point, a meta-analysis looked at interventional nutrition studies and found that exactly 0% of them that were funded by industry reported any unfavorable health conclusions regarding soft drinks, juices, and milk. But 37% of the studies backed by non-industry funding found that they did have a correlation. So the likelihood of reaching a favorable conclusion in those studies was 7.61 times higher compared to that did not receive any industry funding. So again, you can see the influence that food has, right? And you think, well, maybe they just took a page out of the tobacco industry's book. But in fact, 2 of the tobacco industry giants actually got into food manufacturing. So they didn't take a page out of their book. They just pulled their book over to their new company. And so that significantly compromised the science. And why does that matter? Well, the science is what the food guidelines have been based on, right? Goes all the way back to Ansel Keys and to McGovern's original guidelines, all the way up through all the bad decisions that have been made by both parties all along the way. But what happens is when these guidelines get set, they're the dietary guidelines for America, but then that's used as the guideline for the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or what we used to call food stamps. Also sets the standard for the National School Lunch Program, also sets the standards for what we feed our military, what we feed our prisoners, and what we feed our veterans. So when they come out with this, you think, well, gosh, you just have your own free will. You just make your own choices, which in a democracy, we have to have that, of course. But 2 things. One, it really helps to have solid scientific-based guidelines that we can teach our kids so that they can make the right decisions and grow into healthy adults. But also, it guides the SNAP program and the school lunch program and military prisoners, veterans, all these people who then don't really have a choice. And so when they're fed poorly, that doesn't help our country. The previous guidelines, how bad are they? Well, they've got some things right, they've got some things wrong. But the most recent dietary guidelines in 2025, they did not even issue recommendations to limit ultra-processed foods. They did conclude that a diet higher in ultra-processed foods was associated with a greater risk of obesity, but they didn't make the recommendation to limit. When you look at other countries, Brazil actually has the recommendation to avoid ultra-processed foods. They emphasize home cooking, shared meals, and cultural food traditions. Japan, their guidelines are rooted in traditional dietary culture. The Nordic countries recommend minimal intake of processed foods containing high amounts of fat, salt, and sugar. France, their guidelines encourage cooking from scratch, which is essentially another way of saying whole foods. And they recommend minimal processed foods as well. So in 2025, when the dietary guidelines came out, they had the opportunity to at least avoid or limit ultra-processed foods, and no such recommendation was made. Let's talk just a little bit about SNAP, this Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. So how prevalent is that? Well, about 42 million low-income Americans per month get SNAP. And that's about $113 billion in 2023. So what does that mean for children? Well, 1 in 5 children under the age of 17 receive SNAP benefits. So that's 20%, right? And what does that mean? Well, with SNAP benefits, basically anything in the grocery store is fair game. And remember, we talked about of the 300,000 branded products in a grocery store, 70% of them are ultra processed. So SNAP participants can buy anything in a grocery with the exception of alcohol, hot foods or prepared foods, tobacco, and non-food products. So basically, we're taking some of our most vulnerable and giving them the worst diet. We also know that children receiving SNAP benefits are more likely to consume greater quantities of sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats compared to income-eligible non-recipients. SNAP participants also face worse health outcomes and are twice as likely to develop heart disease. Again, is it all related to the diet? Because if you're receiving SNAP benefits, you have a lot of issues that you're dealing with, of course. But the diet clearly is one that we can help to modify. And then when you look at that, you think about the cost of preventable disease on taxpayers. Not only are we paying for the SNAP benefits, but then about 60% of the people who are receiving SNAP are also on Medicaid. And so then we have higher healthcare costs that were secondary to suboptimal nutrition. So we're feeding them poorly, they get sick, and it costs us to feed them, and it costs us to take care of them when they get sick. National School Lunch Program. That's the other big one that the dietary guidelines serve as a marker for. And the National School Lunch Program is present in about 100,000 schools and feeds over 30 million children with an annual cost of about $24 billion. But again, there's no limits on ultra-processed food consumption. And in fact, oftentimes the food manufacturers will make slight modifications to their ultra-processed foods. They'll process their ultra-processed foods just a little bit more so that it meets whatever criteria the government needs. One government program that does seem to be fairly effective is the WIC program, the Program for Women, Infants, and Children. And it's a government program that's exclusively focused on the nutritional health of pregnant and breastfeeding women, and then women who just recently had a baby, and of course the infants up to 5 years of age. And with WIC, they actually provide nutrition education, food assistance, and support. And that affects about 6.7 women and children. And they actually have a proven track record of improving children's health. WIC allows for more health-conscious food purchases and education and recommends increased fruit and vegetable consumption, reduction in juice consumption, reduction in caloric intake, and then actually sort of adjusting the food as the infants get bigger. It's been shown through research that recipients of WIC actually have improved pregnancy outcomes, better birth weights, higher immunization rates, improved diet quality, and better cognitive gains. And in 2009, a study showed that the WIC food package change may have helped reverse increasing obesity childhood rates. So that's the main background for altering the food guidelines. In the Make America Healthy Again report, there was actually a section talking about the cumulative load of chemicals in our environment, which I think is worth reading, as well as the crisis of childhood behavior on the digital age and the over-medication of our children. Interesting, they call it the over-medicalization. So they're not only talking about medication, they're just talking about exposure to the healthcare system excessively altogether. I think the report's worth reading. It's a 75-page report. So I just wanted to hit the dietary components in today's episode so that we'd have a little bit of understanding of why there are changes. Let me just talk briefly about a couple of things. If you'll remember, we know that by eating more carbohydrates and processed foods, you have that cycle that we just discussed where your insulin levels go up and then they drop. And when they drop rapidly, it triggers our hypothalamus, tells us that we're hungry, and we eat again and we just eat more. We know that people that are on ultra-processed food diets tend to eat 500 calories more per day. And we also know as a society that we're exercising less. So just that information alone, you can see where the benefit of minimizing ultra-processed foods is important. If the new dietary guidelines said nothing but avoid ultra-processed foods when possible, that would be a win. The problem with the American diet is we've been led to believe, based on the Ansel Keys study and all that inaccurate information originally, was that fat is the problem. That's what we've been told. Fat is the problem. Everything is about being on a low-fat diet. And again, they took the fat out of food when they processed it. It tastes horrible. They put sugar in, and we all got fat, and we all got diabetes, and we all got sick. Making this change, I think these changes are going to be fairly radical. I think they're going to really stress protein. And they're really going to, I think, flip the current food pyramid upside down. The old food pyramid recommended 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates at its base. Really, that's the problem. We need more protein. We need more fruits and vegetables. And so by flipping it, we're making a big difference. So I hope outlining a little bit of what the problem is historically will help. And then let me just describe a little bit about what ultra-processed foods or what whole foods are. Let me talk a little bit about the whole food diet. So there is no clear diet that is the whole food diet. It's not like it's a program. But what it is it's eating food that's as close to the natural form as possible. So what is processed foods? Well, processing can be anything. If it's pre-cooked, if it's frozen, if it comes in a can, any sort of packaging, any way that it's altered nutritionally, whether it's preserved or fortified, that's all processed. Minimally processed is okay. You wouldn't want to recommend against eating healthy choices that are minimally processed because they are convenient and they are cheap. And it would be very difficult if they just come out and said, you have to eat, essentially only whole foods. That means basically you'd have to go out and grow your own vegetables and kill your own meat. It's not to that extreme, but what you want is just food that's as close to its natural form as possible. And you're right, a lot of these foods are already genetically modified. If you eat a banana, it's very different than its original plantain, but go with what we've got. If it's, someone said if God made it, you can eat it. If you look at the food panel and there's just a bunch of ingredients on there, well, that probably makes it processed. But definitely it's a bunch of ingredients that you haven't heard of, you can't pronounce. And then it's important to look at the sugar that's added and the salt that's added. Whole foods basically are better because they retain their nutrients a lot better. They have antioxidants. We know that people who eat whole food diets tend to take in about 500 calories less than those that eat a diet rich in ultra-processed foods. Again, it's a lot like the Mediterranean diet. There's no clear diet that goes with it. Maybe the closest thing is a company called the Whole30 diet, where they basically go in and it's a big elimination diet where you take all these things out and then you add them back. It's like a 30-day elimination, and I think 10 days you add it back. You can go to their website and look at it. And although I think in the end, it's a good way to do it, I just think anytime you're eliminating or super restrictive, I think it just hurts with compliance. But the whole food diet itself is not a specific diet that you can get online and follow, but rather it's just, eating foods, basically whole grain foods, like oatmeal, brown rice, quinoa, fruits, vegetables, avocado, chicken, steak, eggs, seafood, fish, nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, naturally occurring oils like olive oil or even avocado oil. Some people even include like cheese and yogurt, which, again, that's fine, although those are quite processed. But things that you really want to try to avoid are things like white bread, chips, pizza, basically all fast foods, deli meat, most anything you can put in the microwave, sodas, all those things. It's important to recognize the problem that we've got ourselves into. I hope today's episode shines a little bit of light on how we've got there. And then recognizing the problem is the first thing. So now we've got new dietary guidelines that come out. And so next week, Dr. Britt Morse and I are going to talk about those guidelines. I hope that today's episode makes sense and kind of shines a light on it. If you want more information, there is what's called the MAHA report. You can look at it. Again, I'd ask, please keep the politics out of it. Keep an open mind to this. Let's look and see what the new guidelines have to say, and then figure out a way to incorporate those in an apolitical fashion that really moves the needle forward to our general health and well-being. That's all I have today on the BMI podcast. Thanks for listening. And I'm looking forward to next week with Dr. Morris, where we can discuss the new guidelines and go from there. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI podcast. See you then.